Hello my loves, and welcome back to Strange Playgrounds. And this one is certainly going to be very strange indeed. Skinamarink, yeah. I don't know what that title means. I don't even know, having watched the film. From what I understand, it's a reference to a well-known Canadian nursery rhyme or lullaby or something to that effect. But having watched the film, you would be none the wiser if you don't already have that context. This one is very interesting indeed. Your mileage is almost certainly going to vary. This is the kind of film that is going to completely divide everyone who watches it. People are either going to respond to it or they are not. People are either going to go nuts for it or they are going to loathe it. And neither one is in any way objectively right. It's the kind of film that isn't trying to appeal to the widest possible demographic, and in that it's worthy of plaudits. It's worthy of plaudits for that alone. It is not trying to compromise itself. In fact, it's totally unwilling to do so. It's a film that has its own peculiar cinematic language, its own visual language that you need to learn in order to even understand what is happening in the film. And there are not only so few films that do that, there are so few pieces of visual media that require you to do that and that effectively give you the tools to do so. I think this does. Skinamarink does really beautifully. It establishes very early on what its visual style is, what type of shots it is using, what angles of shots it is using, and they are all almost universally low-angle shots, and they're almost universally still as well. They're often low-angle, looking up at something, looking up. Very often what you're seeing are portals of some description. They are access ways. So doors feature heavily in this, in the visual language of this film. Doors that are partially open or that are just ajar. That is really, really big in the cinematic language of this film. Stairways feature quite heavily. Partially or half-lit rooms feature heavily in the language of this film. And there are reasons for that. And there are also reasons for the low-angle shots. The reason it's doing the low-angle shots, first of all, it inevitably distorts reality via the medium of the camera. When you've got a camera that's basically on the floor, angled so it's just slightly looking up, you get this sort of fisheye distortion where angles don't work properly. They seem to meet in unusual ways or curve in unusual ways, and that creates this very subtle off-kilter feeling. It foments the sense of a reality that's slightly nightmare in its logic. It also makes mapping the environment for the viewer, for the audience, very difficult, because it's very difficult to discern even where familiar doorways or stairwells are actually going. Everything looks slightly off or unreal, and it creates this sense of dislocation. In that regard, it is utterly, utterly brilliant. It's something the film is doing deliberately to unsettle its audience. The other thing it does is that it means you very, very rarely see much of the characters, of the protagonists. Most often, you are seeing their lower legs and their feet. Sometimes, when they're sitting on the floor, you see their backs or the backs of their heads. In very, very, very rare instances, you see their profiles as they turn away from something. The camera is almost always behind the protagonists, and that's also very interesting in and of itself. You very rarely see faces in this film, very rarely, and even when you do, they are turned away from you. It's a fascinating lexicon that this film has, and you've got to learn it quite quickly in order to get what the film is doing. It's a film that sincerely, and I would say very successfully, recreates the logic of a childhood nightmare. A lot of films try to do that. They try to capture that quintessence of what unsettles and what disturbs us, but very often they fail. There are very few films that do it. A lot of David Lynch's work does it. Mulholland Drive does it beautifully. Fire Walk With Me does it quite beautifully. A lot of Twin Peaks does it really well. Some of Cronenberg's work does it. Jacob's Ladder does it really, really well. This is probably one of the most successful examples of this. But as a result of the lexicon that it uses, and as a result of the fact that it's all phenomenally low budget. I mean, this is one of the lowest budget films I've seen in a long, long time. Everything is deliberately fuzzy and hazy and soft focus, and it feels very unreal. A lot of people are going to find this difficult to get on with. Also, it takes forever to establish itself, and that again I feel is deliberate. I feel it's what it's doing is ratcheting up the tension. It's arch in the way that it frames its characters, its story, and its environment. It will linger forever over these low-angle shots of slightly open doors that are, I find, very disturbing. I find that the juxtapositions it throws up are almost surreal. You know, this has more than an element of surrealist cinema about it. There are elements of it that recall to me things like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It has, you know, the angles and the weird sort of the weird framing of its shots feels like surrealist cinema. And the way it tells its story, because the story is not overtly communicated, and certainly not in a way that many fans of even horror cinema, and even of this I mean, it's not found footage. That would be wrong, because it isn't found footage. There's no one here who is actually sort of carrying a camera and filming what's going on, insofar as you're aware. And that makes it sinister in and of itself, because it has the quality of found footage and of documentary, but who's holding the camera? That's a question that has to be asked while you're watching this film. Who is doing the filming? Why is the footage so low? Why is it always following the two child protagonists, you know? There's almost a sense that the camera, the audience are they are behind the eyes of whatever entity or force or phenomena is cultivating the horror around them. And that's very disturbing in and of itself. But it lingers forever on these shots of doors, of like door frames and stairwells, and all you're doing is hearing. There's a very distinct and very well developed soundscape in this film, where early on, it's technically just the sounds of a house. It's just like ambient noises. It's buzzing halogen lights. It's rumbling pipes and so on and so forth. But that escalates as the film goes on. And if you listen carefully, you'll start to hear voices and suggestions of voices, and they become more and more overt as the film goes on. The soundscape is also one of those things, like the perspective that is played with. So you'll hear voices from far away, and they're very hard to make out sometimes, but then you'll hear them right next to you, but it's as though no transition has been made. There hasn't been time for whatever's speaking to get from point A to point B, and that's very disturbing in and of itself. This film is a real technical exercise in the art, the craft of low-budget horror filmmaking. So the filmmakers are using very finite resources in order to cultivate this sense of dislocation and of a sense of being unsettled. And for me personally, I thought it did it brilliantly. Because this film is not only trying to recreate a child, like the feeling, the ethos of a childhood nightmare, and also the logic of a childhood nightmare. It's also very subtly recalling the innate traumas of childhood, the fears of things like, for example, abandonment is a big one in this. That wonderful uncertainty that is part and parcel of childhood perception. Very young children, before their sense of reality has crystallized, are often very anxious and afraid at inert things, things that are for the older child or for the adult absolutely certain. So when this door opens, it's always onto the same place, right? Because that's the way doors work. When you turn this corner, it's going to be into this hallway or into that area because that's the way the world works. But not in Skinamarink. Not in Skinamarink. It's established quite early on that the environment is kind of malleable. It's kind of fluid and protean, in the manner of a very young child's perception of reality, in the manner of their imagination, but also in the manner of film. Film is like that because by its very nature, environment within film is contrived and therefore malleable. It's protean, and this plays with that. It draws that parallel really beautifully between the medium of film and the perception of a child. And that is absolutely brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. It's also one of the very few films I've come across that acknowledges this aspect of childhood. It is not interested in painting a sort of halcyon dream of childhood. It goes for the darkness of childhood, the fear, the anxiety, the uncertainty. And what's really interesting is the horror in this film also works on childhood logic, at least for a little while. The setup, you have to sort of determine this for yourself because it's never really spelled out. But the setup is you've got two protagonists, two children, brother and sister. There's some unusual family tension that seems to be occurring. There is a suggestion that the mum and dad are estranged somehow, but that's never really made absolutely overt. You have to sort of piece that together from context clues. And what happens is the children wake up one night or morning and their mum and dad are gone. So again, recalling a very acute childhood fear. But also, all of the walls, all of the doors and the windows in the house have vanished. They're sealed in, and there's something strange going on. The television downstairs is on and can't be turned off, and it's continuously playing these old, very old sort of 1940s cartoons over and over again. There is something very strange going on here, and that phenomena, whatever is happening to them, escalates and escalates and escalates. They are trapped in this house for a period of what could be days, could be weeks, could be months, and things keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. The strangeness just keeps escalating and escalating. And there is a sense that there is something that is non-distinct. It's not a ghost, it could be a demon, I suppose, but it has capacities that seem to be beyond that of a ghost or a demon or anything so definable. This entity, whatever it is, seems to be more Lovecraftian because it can alter reality. It can do things with reality. Like, interestingly, another one of the parallels that it draws is that the entity is manipulating reality in the same way that the children manipulate their toys. There are lots of shots, for example, of building blocks and of cities and of structures made of building blocks and of them then being broken down. And that symbolically refers to what is happening to reality here. This entity, or whatever it is, seems to be very childlike in many, many respects, in the sense that it kind of is playful and that it doesn't have much regard for its toys. It's fascinated with them, but it gets frustrated with them when they don't do what it wants or when they don't entertain it, in the same way that a child does with their own toys. It's just that here, the toys are living entities. They are human beings. And that's really fascinating. It's also phenomenally cruel, this entity. Again, in the way that children can be. It often reacts to the children doing things that it doesn't want them to do. And they're often perfectly innocent things, but somehow it's offended, those actions or those statements have offended this entity, and it responds quite dramatically to that. And you never know quite what it is, what it's doing, what it wants, and that is true of the children too. They are children, and therefore they don't know what it is or what it wants, even though they talk to it, even though they ask it. It's a really interesting. It seems to be, the entity almost seems to be the manifestation of what a child would imagine, of what they would fear, of something they would conjure, of what a sort of particularly anxious child would imagine being out in the hallway at night, or in their wardrobe, or in the shadows. That's what this seems to be. It's almost like it's coalesced from their anxieties and from their fears. I mean, you can even read this as though there is a sort of Stephen King thing happening, that the children are somehow manifesting or expressing this phenomena, and indeed this entity, from their own imaginations. That is a definite reading of this. And it gets nasty. I mean, one of the other things I will say about this film, it's very unpleasant. It's very, 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 very unpleasant indeed. If you find yourself sort of triggered by scenes of childhood abandonment, of children in fear and in states of disturbance and pain, don't watch this. Don't watch it. You won't like it. You will find it very hard going. I mean, I found it very hard going. I felt the tension of it was profound. The dread was awful. It was really, by the end, I was sort of very, very, very tense indeed, because I sincerely didn't know what this film was going to do. It's quite unpredictable in that regard. And I liked it. I really, really enjoyed it. I found it to be a fascinatingly arch, weird, unusual, very, very disturbing horror film of a kind I haven't really seen before. It's almost art house in its style and its communications, and that will alienate a hell of a lot of people. I've already spoken to people who really didn't like it, who found it very, very difficult, and it's also, I mean, like, its technical aspects as well, that alienated a lot of people, because there is a feeling that it's almost just like a tech demo, that it's just like a filmmaker sort of experimenting with techniques and visualizations and whatnot. I disagree myself. I found it very, very heartfelt and beautiful. I felt that it was referring back to perhaps childhood fears and traumas that the filmmakers had had, or that the writer had had, or concerns that they carried over into adulthood. And I really liked it for that. I liked its sincerity. But I've spoken to a lot of people who really hated this, who really didn't like it, could not get on with it at all. And it is that kind of film. It's deliberately alienating. Deliberately. It is deliberately talking to a particular audience that it knows will find it arousing and will have a sort of frisson with its subjects and its style, and it's only talking to them. To anyone else, it's basically saying, don't care, fuck off. It has that feeling about it. It is deliberately alienating. I liked it for that. I really quite appreciated that element of it, and I kind of wish certainly more horror films would do that. Just talk to the audience that they want to, and stop trying to appeal to the widest possible demographic. That would be wonderful. I think we would have a wealth of far more sincere, interesting art as a result of that. But hey, that's sadly not where we're at with mainstream horror at the moment. And this is not mainstream, not by any way, shape or form. It's a very fascinating piece of work, and whether you engage with it or not, that will just depend on what your reaction is from the first half an hour or so, I would say. If you still haven't got into it in the first half an hour, it probably isn't going to speak to you at all. But for me, it was one of the most interesting horror films I've seen in a donkey's age. I really, really enjoyed it.